It started like any other travel day. The airport buzzed with the usual energy of rushing passengers, distant announcements echoing through the halls, and the hum of rolling suitcases on polished floors. Among the crowd was a woman with a quiet confidence that turned heads. She carried herself with grace, her dark skin glowing under the fluorescent lights, and her stylish yet practical attire hinted at someone who had places to be and stories to tell. She arrived early, her ticket and ID in hand, ready for what should have been a routine journey. As she approached the security line, she couldn't shake a subtle feeling of unease. Airports had a way of putting everyone on edge, but this time, it felt heavier. She reminded herself to breathe, brushing off the feeling as nothing more than pre-flight jitters. The line moved slowly, each passenger stepping forward one by one to place their belongings in gray plastic bins. She watched as families wrangled children, business travelers typed furiously on laptops, and tourists snapped selfies. When her turn came, she smiled politely at the TSA agent, placing her items on the conveyor belt and walking through the scanner. But then, something shifted. "Ma'am, could you step aside for a moment?" The words were sharp, cold, and loud enough for others to hear. Her stomach tightened as she looked up to see the agent staring at her with an expression that was hard to read, part suspicion, part something she couldn't quite name. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "We just need to do a routine check," the agent replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. She noticed the glances from other passengers as they hurried past, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. She told herself it wasn't personal, that this was just protocol, but the knot in her chest grew tighter with each passing second. What started as a simple pat-down turned into something more invasive. The questions began rapid, pointed, and oddly specific. Where was she going? Why was she traveling alone? Did she pack her own bag? Her responses were measured, but the doubt in the agent's eyes didn't waver. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew. She could feel her pulse in her ears, a mixture of frustration and something she hated to admit, fear. It wasn't just the inconvenience, it was the unmistakable sense that she was being judged for more than the contents of her luggage. A small crowd began to gather nearby, their whispers floating in the air like static. She caught fragments of their conversations, words like suspicious, unnecessary, and ridiculous. Some people looked sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few seemed to agree with what was happening. Just when she thought it couldn't get worse, a second agent approached, his demeanor even sterner than the first. He carried a clipboard and wore an expression that suggested he had already made up his mind. "Ma'am, we need to ask you to come with us," he said, motioning toward a side room. Her heart sank. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Standard procedure," he replied, but the words felt hollow. She glanced around, hoping to catch the eye of someone who might intervene, but no one stepped forward. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in as she followed the agents, each step heavier than the last. What happened next would change everything, not just for her but for everyone watching. The room they led her into was cold and unwelcoming, with harsh fluorescent lights and walls painted a dull shade of beige. A single table sat in the center, flanked by 2 chairs on either side. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the door clicking shut behind her. The sound sent a chill through her, as if the world outside had been sealed away. "Take a seat," one of the agents said, gesturing toward the chair. She complied, setting her purse on the floor beside her. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the agents settled in across from her. One of them, the man with the clipboard, flipped through papers with a furrowed brow. The other, a younger woman with sharp features, tapped a pen against the table. Neither seemed in a hurry to explain why she was there. "What's this about?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. "We need to verify some information." Routine security measures. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Routine. The word was starting to sound like a cruel joke. I've already answered your questions, she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. Is there something specific you're looking for? The man exchanged a glance with his colleague before leaning forward. You were flagged for additional screening, he said. It's nothing to worry about, but we need to be thorough. Flagged? The word echoed in her mind, heavy and ominous. She thought back to the check-in process. The security line. Had she done something wrong? No, she'd followed every instruction, handed over her ID, walked through the scanner without issue. So why did it feel like she was being singled out? The questions started again, but this time they were different. More personal. They asked about her job, her family, even her childhood. Each inquiry felt like a thread being pulled, unraveling pieces of her life that had nothing to do with her travel plans. Where are you staying? The woman asked, her tone sharp. With a friend, she replied. What's their name? She hesitated. Why does that matter? It's standard procedure, the woman repeated, her expression unchanging. The words stung more than they should have. Standard for who? She wondered. Her frustration grew with each passing minute, but she knew better than to let it show. She'd seen how quickly situations like this could escalate, especially for someone who looked like her. As the questioning dragged on, her mind raced. Was this really just about security, or was there something more sinister at play? She thought of the countless stories she'd read, of people stopped for no reason other than the color of their skin, their accents, or the way they dressed. She'd always tried to believe the world was better than that, but sitting in this room, it was hard to hold on to that hope. Outside, the airport carried on as usual. Flights were called, passengers rushed to gates, and life moved forward. But for her, time seemed to have stopped. She felt trapped in a moment that refused to end, the weight of 1,000 invisible judgments pressing down on her. At one point, the man with the clipboard stood and left the room, leaving her alone with the woman. The air grew heavier, the silence thick with unspoken tension. She tried to meet the agent's gaze, but the woman avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the notes in front of her. I don't understand why this is happening, she said finally, breaking the silence. I've done nothing wrong. The agent didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. It's not personal, she said. But it felt personal. It felt like every unspoken bias, every subtle assumption, had converged in this moment, turning her into a suspect without cause. When the man returned, he wasn't alone. Another agent followed him in, this one older, with an air of authority that made the room feel even smaller. He introduced himself briefly, his tone clipped and professional, before taking the seat across from her. We've reviewed your information, he said, folding his hands on the table. And we have a few concerns. Her heart sank. Concerns. The word was vague enough to be terrifying. What kind of concerns? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a file and began flipping through pages, his expression giving nothing away. She felt like a bug under a magnifying glass, every aspect of her life scrutinized without explanation. As the minutes dragged on, she couldn't help but wonder if anyone outside this room knew what was happening. Did the people she'd passed in the terminal, the families and tourists and business travelers, have any idea what she was going through? Would they care if they did? The older agent finally looked up, his gaze piercing. We've noticed some discrepancies in your travel history, he said. Her brows furrowed. Discrepancies? What are you talking about? He didn't elaborate, instead turning the page in his file. We're just trying to piece everything together, he said. The vagueness was maddening. She felt her composure slipping, but she clung to it like a lifeline. She refused to let them see how much this was affecting her. But deep down, she knew this was more than a misunderstanding. There was something bigger at play, something she couldn't quite grasp. And whatever it wasn't going to end here. She sat there, feeling every second pass as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. The word discrepancies echoed in her mind, looping over and over without an answer. What could they possibly mean? She had booked her flight through a trusted travel site, double-checked all her documents, and followed every rule. There was nothing out of place, at least, not as far as she knew. The older agent tapped a pen against the table, his expression neutral yet unreadable. He leaned back slightly, studying her as though waiting for her to slip, to say something that would confirm whatever suspicions they were clinging to. She refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking. "I don't understand," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exasperation. "I've been upfront about everything. What kind of discrepancies are you talking about?" He exchanged a glance with the younger woman, who seemed hesitant to speak. Finally, he folded his hands and leaned forward. "It's not unusual for people to withhold information," he said. "Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. We just need clarity." "I haven't withheld anything," she replied, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You've asked me 100 questions, and I've answered them all. What more do you want?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "Let's start with why your travel itinerary was flagged." Her breath caught. Flagged. The word felt heavier now, as though it carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know why it was flagged," she said. "I booked my ticket, just like everyone else. There's nothing unusual about it." "Then why," he said, pausing for emphasis, "was your name associated with multiple high-risk travel alerts?" The question hit her like a slap. "What?" "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising. "I've never been involved in anything like that." The man raised an eyebrow. "You've never traveled to certain countries recently flagged for security risks? Never made any last-minute changes to your plans?" She shook her head, incredulous. "No. I haven't done anything like that. I don't know where you're getting this information, but it's wrong." The woman at his side cleared her throat. "Sometimes these alerts are triggered by errors," she said, her tone softer. "It could be a case of mistaken identity." "Then why am I being treated like a criminal?" She shot back, her composure slipping. "If this is a mistake, why aren't you fixing it instead of dragging me through this?" The older agent didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back again, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to determine if she was lying. She felt the familiar sting of being doubted, of having to defend herself for reasons that had nothing to do with who she was. The silence was broken by a knock on the door. Another agent entered, carrying a folder thick with papers. He whispered something to the older man, who nodded and began flipping through the new documents. She tried to read his expression, but it was no use. Whatever they were looking at, it only deepened the pit forming in her stomach. Minutes passed in unbearable quiet. The younger agent avoided eye contact, her pen still tapping against the table in a rhythm that grated on every nerve. Finally, the older man closed the folder and turned back to her. "Your travel history raises questions," he said. "But there's something else that concerns us." She blinked, her mind racing. "Something else?" He nodded, his tone carefully measured. "The contents of your luggage." Her stomach dropped. She had packed the night before, carefully folding clothes and neatly arranging her toiletries. There was nothing unusual, nothing that should have caused alarm. "What about my luggage?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. He slid a photo across the table. It showed an item she didn't recognize, a small electronic device, unmarked and unfamiliar. "This was found in your bag," he said. She stared at the photo, her heart pounding. "That's not mine," she said quickly. I've never seen that before. It was in your bag, the man repeated, his tone flat. No, it wasn't, she insisted. I packed my bag myself. I would know if I had something like that. The tension in the room thickened. The younger agent finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. Sometimes items can be planted, she said, glancing nervously at her colleague. It's rare, but it happens. Planted? The older man frowned. Let's not jump to conclusions. But the suggestion lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Could someone have slipped the device into her bag? And if so, why? The idea seemed absurd, yet it was the only explanation that made sense. She couldn't shake the image of the security line, the countless hands and eyes that could have tampered with her belongings without her noticing. I don't know how it got there, she said, her voice firm despite the fear creeping into her chest. But it's not mine. The older agent didn't look convinced. We'll need to investigate further, he said. Until then, you're not free to leave. Her world seemed to tilt. What does that mean? Are you detaining me? Consider it a precaution, he said. For your safety and ours. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she sat there, feeling the walls close in as the weight of their accusations pressed down on her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if every breath she took carried the weight of their suspicions. She gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she fought to keep her composure. The words "not free to leave" echoed in her mind, louder and more ominous with each repetition. How had it come to this? A simple flight had turned into a nightmare, and no matter what she said, it felt like she was sinking deeper into a trap she couldn't escape. The older agent stood, gathering the folders and exchanging a few quiet words with the younger woman. Then, without another glance, he left the room, leaving her alone with the remaining agent. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. She wanted to demand answers, to insist they explain what was happening, but something in the woman's expression stopped her. There was a flicker of doubt there, a hesitation that hinted at something more. I didn't pack that device, she said finally, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. I swear, I've never seen it before. The woman sighed, setting her pen down. Things aren't always as they seem, she said softly. But you have to understand, we can't ignore a potential threat. A threat? She stared in disbelief. Do I look like a threat to you? The woman didn't answer, her gaze dropping to the table instead. It was the kind of non-answer that said everything. She felt her chest tighten, a mix of anger and hurt bubbling beneath the surface. No matter how polite they tried to sound, the underlying message was clear: they didn't trust her. Minutes turned into an eternity as she sat there, the silence stretching until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't the older agent who entered but someone new, a man in a suit, his demeanor calm but commanding. He introduced himself as part of the airport's security oversight team, his voice smooth and practiced, like someone used to diffusing tense situations. We're working to resolve this as quickly as possible, he said, taking the seat across from her. But we need your full cooperation. I've been cooperating, she said, her frustration finally breaking through. I've answered all your questions, and I've told you that device isn't mine. What more do you want from me? He held up a hand, as if to calm her. We're not accusing you of anything yet. But we have to follow protocol. Situations like this require thorough investigation. Situations like this? She repeated the words bitterly. What does that even mean? You're treating me like a criminal based on something I didn't do. He didn't flinch at her tone, his expression remaining neutral. Our goal is to ensure everyone's safety, he said. Including yours. The words rang hollow. She could feel the tension in her body, every muscle coiled as though bracing for impact. They were dancing around the truth, avoiding the real reason she was sitting in this room. It wasn't just about the device. It was about her, who she was, what she looked like, and the assumptions they'd made the moment she stepped into that airport. "Have you considered that someone planted it?" she asked, her voice rising. "You said it yourself, it's not unheard of. Why aren't you looking into that?" "We're considering all possibilities," he said, his tone maddeningly even. "But we can't rule anything out." The door opened again, and the older agent returned, holding a tablet in his hand. He handed it to the man in the suit, who studied the screen for a long moment before looking back at her. His expression didn't change, but there was a new tension in his posture. "We've reviewed the surveillance footage," he said. "There's something you need to see." Her heart raced as he turned the tablet toward her. The video showed the security checkpoint, the familiar chaos of travelers shuffling through lines and placing their belongings on the conveyor belt. She saw herself in the footage, calmly placing her bag on the belt and stepping through the scanner. For a moment, it seemed normal, mundane, even. But then, something changed. A man in a dark jacket appeared in the corner of the frame, moving quickly and purposefully. He paused near the conveyor belt, his hands brushing against the luggage as though adjusting something. Her bag. Her breath caught as she watched him slip something into the side pocket before disappearing into the crowd. She pointed at screen, her voice trembling with urgency. "There. That's him. He's the one who did it." The man in the suit didn't react, his expression remaining calm as he set the tablet down. "We're working to identify him," he said. "But until we do, we need to proceed carefully." "Carefully?" Her voice rose, a mix of disbelief and fury. "You have proof that I didn't do anything, and you're still treating me like I'm guilty?" The older agent finally spoke, his tone measured. "This footage raises questions, but it doesn't answer all of them. We need to understand why someone would target you specifically." Target her. The words sent a chill down her spine. She hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't considered that this might be deliberate. But if it was, the implications were terrifying. Who would do this to her, and why? What could they possibly gain by planting something in her bag? The man in the suit leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Until we have all the facts, we can't make any assumptions. But we need your help to figure this out." Her mind raced, 1,000 questions flooding her thoughts. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, the pressure to defend herself against something she didn't even understand. And beneath it all, a growing fear that this wasn't over, that the worst was still to come. The tension in the room shifted, an almost imperceptible crack in the facade of control held by the agents. They were still in charge, but now there was something else, a hint of doubt, maybe even unease. She noticed it in the way the older agent's grip tightened on his pen, and the subtle change in the man in the suit's posture. They didn't have all the answers, and that realization sent a flicker of vindication through her frustration. But the moment was fleeting, overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. "Why would anyone target me?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. The question hung in the air, unanswered. She wasn't sure if they didn't know or simply didn't want to tell her, but the lack of response only made her more anxious. The man in the suit glanced at the younger agent, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "There are several possibilities," he said finally. "It could be a random act, a case of mistaken identity. Or it could be something more deliberate." "Deliberate?" Her chest tightened. "You think someone did this on purpose? Why would they do that?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," he replied. His calm tone was meant to reassure her, but it only fueled her frustration. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "You're telling me someone planted something in my bag, and you don't even know why? You've been interrogating me for hours, making me feel like a criminal, And now you're saying this could all be because of someone else's mistake? We're investigating every angle, the older agent interjected, his tone firm. But until we know more, we need you to cooperate. I have been cooperating, she snapped, unable to hold back her anger any longer. I've answered every question, sat here while you accused me of things I didn't do, and now you're saying this isn't even about me? Do you have any idea what this feels like? Her voice echoed in the small room, and for a moment, no one spoke. She could see the younger agent's discomfort, the way her eyes flicked between her and the older man as if searching for a way to defuse the situation. But the man in the suit remained unfazed, his gaze steady and calculating. Then the door opened again, and another agent entered, carrying a phone. He handed it to the man in the suit, murmuring something too quiet for her to hear. Whatever he said made the man's expression harden, his brows drawing together in a way that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, standing and stepping out of the room with the phone. The door closed behind him, leaving her alone again with the other two agents. The silence that followed was suffocating. She could feel her heart pounding, each beat echoing in her ears. What was happening? What had that call been about? She wanted to demand answers, but the tension in the room made her hesitate. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, before the man in the suit returned. His expression was different now, sharper, more focused. He sat down without a word, placing the phone on the table in front of him. "We've received new information," he said, his tone brisk. "It seems this situation is more complex than we initially thought." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The man in the footage, the one who tampered with your bag, has been identified. He's connected to an ongoing investigation." "Investigation?" Her voice shook. "What kind of investigation?" The older agent leaned forward, his expression grim. "A smuggling operation. High-value items, including sensitive materials, being transported through unsuspecting passengers." The room spun. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. "You're saying someone used me to smuggle something? Why me? I don't know anything about this." "That's what we're trying to determine," the man in the suit said. "It's possible you were chosen at random, but we can't rule out other possibilities." Her mind raced, trying to process what they were saying. It didn't make sense. She wasn't involved in anything illegal, she barely even jaywalked. How could she have been caught up in something like this? But before she could voice her thoughts, the man continued. "There's more," he said, his tone heavy. "We've reviewed additional footage, and it appears you were followed before you even entered the airport." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Followed? By who?" "We don't know yet," he admitted. "But this changes the nature of the situation. It's no longer just about the device in your bag. There's a larger pattern at play." Her hands trembled as she tried to wrap her head around what he was saying. "Followed. Targeted. Used." The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's story, not hers. But the fear coursing through her was all too real. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze didn't waver. "We need to keep you here until we can ensure your safety and confirm the extent of your involvement, or lack thereof." Her chest tightened, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. It was bigger than she could have imagined, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she would make it out unscathed. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air heavy with tension as she tried to make sense of everything she just heard. Her mind raced through every moment leading up to this point, searching for anything that might explain how she had been dragged into this nightmare. But there was nothing. She had done everything right, and yet here she was, caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with her. The man in the suit leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "We believe you were targeted because you fit a profile they were looking for, an unsuspecting traveler, someone unlikely to draw attention. Unfortunately, that means you were put in harm's way without your knowledge." Her heart sank. "So, you're saying I was just convenient for them?" "That's one possibility," he said. "But there's another theory we're considering." She froze, her pulse quickening. "What theory?" He exchanged a glance with the older agent before speaking again. "We've uncovered evidence that suggests this operation might be tied to someone you know." The words hit her like a slap. "Someone I know?" "No. That's impossible. I don't know anyone who would do something like this." The man's expression didn't waver. "Think carefully. Has anyone in your life behaved strangely recently? Maybe someone who suddenly showed an unusual interest in your travel plans?" She opened her mouth to deny it again but stopped herself. A memory surfaced unbidden. A friend, more of an acquaintance, really, who had been oddly insistent about her trip. They'd asked about her itinerary, even offered to help with her packing, something that had struck her as overly familiar at the time. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "There is someone. But I didn't think anything of it at the time. They just seemed curious." The man's gaze sharpened. "Do you have their name? Contact information?" She nodded, her mind racing as she provided the details. The agents exchanged another look, this one laced with urgency. The man in the suit stood abruptly, signaling to one of his colleagues. "We'll follow up on this lead immediately." The minutes that followed felt endless. She was left alone in the room, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to process what was happening. The idea that someone she knew could have been involved in this was almost too much to bear. How could anyone be so cruel, so reckless? When the man in the suit finally returned, his expression was unreadable. He took his seat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "We've located the individual you mentioned," he said. "They'd been brought in for questioning." Her breath caught. "And? What did they say?" He hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, pity, maybe, or regret. "They admitted to planting the device in your bag," he said. "They were coerced into doing so by a larger network. They claimed they had no choice." The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. Relief that her innocence was finally proven mixed with a deep sense of betrayal. "Why me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did they choose me?" "They thought you would be easy to manipulate," he said quietly. "Someone who wouldn't fight back. But you proved them wrong." She wanted to feel vindicated, but the weight of what had happened was too heavy. She had been used, targeted, and dragged through an ordeal she wouldn't wish on anyone. And yet, even now, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The man in the suit stood, his expression softening. "You're free to go," he said. "We'll be in touch if we need any further information." She nodded numbly, gathering her things and leaving the room. The airport felt different now, its bustling energy tainted by the memory of what had happened. As she made her way toward the exit, she couldn't help but look over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching her, waiting to pull her back into the chaos. It wasn't until she reached the taxi stand that she allowed herself to breathe. The crisp air was a welcome relief, clearing her head as she tried to process everything. She climbed into a cab, giving the driver her address. As the car pulled away, she stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. But just as she began to relax, her phone buzzed with a notification. She hesitated before picking it up, her stomach knotting as she saw the message. It was from an unknown number, and it read, "You think it's over, but it's not. Watch your back." Her blood ran cold. The ordeal she thought had ended was far from over. The message on her phone felt like a trapdoor opening beneath her, plunging her back into the fear she had only just begun to shake off. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, her mind racing with questions. Who had sent it? How did they have her number? And most terrifying of all, what did they mean? The cab driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, concern flickering across his face. You okay, miss? He asked, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. She forced a nod, slipping the phone into her pocket as if hiding it could make the message disappear. Yeah, I'm fine, she lied, her voice tight. She wasn't fine. Not even close. The relief she'd felt moments ago had been shattered, replaced by a creeping dread that made her question everything. As the cab pulled up to her building, she hesitated before stepping out. The shadows seemed darker, the street quieter than usual. She scanned her surroundings, half expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. But there was no one there, just the faint hum of the streetlights and the occasional car passing by. Still, her nerves were on edge as she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Her apartment felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. She double-checked the locks, drew the curtains, and sank onto the couch, her mind still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that whoever had sent the message was closer than she realized. Her phone buzzed again, and she flinched, her heart pounding as she reached for it. But this time, it was a call from the man in the suit. We've traced the number, he said without preamble. It's connected to a burner phone, likely discarded immediately after the message was sent. Her stomach sank. So you can't track them? Not directly, he admitted. But we're monitoring activity in the area. You're not alone in this. We'll keep you safe. The words were meant to be reassuring, but they only added to her unease. She thanked him and hung up, but the pit in her stomach remained. She couldn't just sit here, waiting for someone to make their next move. She needed answers, real ones, not vague reassurances that someone else was handling it. The next day, she made her way back to the airport. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she felt drawn there, as if the answers she needed were buried somewhere in the chaos of the terminal. The buzz of travelers moving through the space was overwhelming, but she focused on retracing her steps, replaying everything that had happened in her mind. She paused near the security checkpoint, her gaze sweeping over the area. It looked so ordinary now, so mundane. But it was here that her nightmare had begun. She spotted one of the agents she'd spoken to during her ordeal, the younger woman who had seemed conflicted throughout the interrogation. Summoning her courage, she approached. The agent's eyes widened in recognition. You shouldn't be here, she said, glancing around nervously. It's not safe. I got another message, she said, her voice firm despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. Someone's still targeting me, and I need to know why. Please. You seemed like you wanted to help. The agent hesitated, her gaze darting toward the cameras mounted on the walls. Finally, she sighed and motioned for her to follow. They slipped into a quiet corner of the terminal, away from prying eyes. There's more to this than I'm allowed to say, the agent admitted, her voice low. But I can tell you this, the people behind this are bigger than we thought. They're organized, and they don't like loose ends. Loose ends? She repeated, her stomach twisting. You think they see me as a threat? The agent nodded grimly. You were supposed to be an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back. But now that you've seen their faces, heard their names, you're a liability. Her breath caught. Liability. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. So what do I do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The agent hesitated, then slipped a small card into her hand. There's someone who might be able to help, she said. But you didn't hear this from me. She glanced at the card. It was plain, with nothing but a name and a phone number printed on it. She looked up to thank the agent, but she was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Back in her apartment, she stared at the card, debating whether to make the call. Every instinct told her this was a risk, but what choice did she have? She couldn't keep living like this, looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. The voice on the other end was calm and measured. "I've been expecting your call," they said. Her pulse quickened. "Who are you?" "Let's just say I specialize in situations like yours," they replied. "I can help, but you'll have to trust me." It felt like stepping off a ledge, but she nodded, even though they couldn't see her. "What do I need to do?" Over the next few days, she followed their instructions carefully. They guided her through securing her digital footprint, changing her routines, and taking steps to protect herself. Slowly, she began to feel a semblance of control returning, though the fear never fully left. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture, a blurry shot of someone standing outside her building. Her blood ran cold. They were closer than she'd thought. Before she could react, her phone buzzed again. It was the same unknown number, but this time, the message was simple: "Time's up." Her first instinct was to run, but before she could move, there was a knock at the door. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly she approached, peering through the peephole. To her relief, it was the man in the suit, flanked by 2 other agents. "We've been monitoring the area," he said as she opened the door. "We've got them." The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by exhaustion. The ordeal was finally over, or so she thought. As they escorted her to safety, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The network they'd uncovered wasn't going to disappear overnight, and she couldn't help but wonder how many other innocent people were out there, caught in its web. In the days that followed, she worked closely with the authorities, sharing everything she knew. It was a slow, grueling process, but it felt like taking back a piece of the control she'd lost. And though she would never forget what had happened, she vowed to use her experience to help others, to ensure that no one else would have to go through what she had. The nightmares still came, but with time, they began to fade. She was stronger now, more aware of the world's darker corners, but also more determined to shine a light on them. And though she couldn't change what had happened, she could choose how to move forward. One step at a time, she began to rebuild, knowing that she had survived the worst and come out the other side.